Hello, 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 hello. It is your good friend, Wild Philosopher, here once more to remind you that fairies are real. And in fact, that's the topic of tonight's stream. We will be doing a deep dive into lore surrounding the fairy folk, the undead, other worlds, and festivals in tune with tonight, which, as you all know, is All Hallows Eve, when the dead walk and the boundary between worlds grows thin. So, as I said, we'll be talking about other worlds, we'll be talking about fairies, and there's sort of their relation to other worlds. We will be talking about other worlds that have nothing to do with fairies. And so this one, because Halloween is a Celtic holiday, will be focusing mostly on Celtic lore. But we will be using some comparative methods where applicable, because a lot of the sillier views on Halloween are intimately tied to people who do a deep dive into only Celtic lore and don't look at any of the very well established emic parallels to elsewhere, and then reach conclusions that are bizarre and fantastical, for lack of a better word, such as that all Irish folklore was made up by Christian clerics trying to Celticize Homer for some reason. Which was, he said that was Mallory's hypothesis.
Yeah, Mallory.
Yes, J.P. Mallory. Otherwise, an excellent scholar. I was always surprised when Ryan told me that, because Mallory's an Indo-Europeanist, did a lot of excellent work. I want to say he was involved in the Tarim Basin project, so I was absolutely astounded to read.
Yeah, he did some work on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Good work there. Good work on Indo-European. His work on the Irish Dreamtime, less good. C'est quoi c'est. It is what it is. But yeah, we're going to start here. Other worlds are interesting. They're very interesting things to study. Because sometimes when we do streams, I note that one of the things you have to break through to really start doing philosophy is you have to stop allowing sort of normative, cultural dictates about what is right, dictate how you think. Right? Not because I hate culture or because I think you should never agree with the surroundings, but too often people mistake like the culturally approved ways of thinking or culturally approved thoughts for what is rational in and of itself, the latter of which involves actual thinking. And when you make that elision, you risk dissolving your ability to actually engage in rational thought, which, even if your culture is correct, right, and sometimes often it is. This isn't an anti-culture remark, but even then, you do want to be able to think cogently. Right? It's not enough just to accept science because the people in charge tell you science is rational. You want to know, if you want to be a good philosopher, you want to know how science works. You want to know, like, what is the scientific method? How do we use it? What are its limits? What are its extent? What can it tell us? What can't it tell us? What sort of things can be tested and what can't? So on and so forth. As I said, not because I'm picking this example because it's obvious. Well, I wouldn't say it's obviously one that's true, but it's obviously one that's on the less false end. And yet, not knowing how science functions can just get you into such hot water. Like anyone who's read any science journalism knows how much crapulously bad research gets reported in the news as a fact. And I just bring this up here because Otherworlds are a really, really good example of this, right? Because you get into Otherworlds and you sort of people have their expectations, and some of them aren't bad. Like, they absolutely I will 100% admit, when we started going into this, I actually shared some of the very popular fake expectations. The chief among them, I'm going to pick on Isekai here for a moment. Not to critique Isekai, but just to use it as an example. People often treat fairyland, fairy world. Sounds like an amusement park. Fairy world. They'll treat fairyland or the realms of the dead or Elysium or any of these other worlds or underworlds that populate our consciousness as if they were identical to like reincarnated in another world with my smartphone, where you pop through and you're just in. It's like our world, but it's another world. It's just sort of it's another dimension, right? In fact, for those in philosophy, for those of you who are really into philosophy, philosophers, you might be a little confused because I've just been using Otherworld, which in philosophy does just mean another world like ours, except with slightly different logical conditions. Right. Yeah, Brikansuki comments bringing up the worst Isekai. Yes. Well, see, if I have to critique something, it's important to pick the one nobody will get upset about me critiquing. But yes, those of you who are really into philosophy, you're probably familiar with Lewis's Otherworld theory, which very much operates in sort of like when I say otherworld, I mean a world that's just like ours, except all the people's hair are blue, right? Or people ride unicorns instead of cars, and so on and so forth. Admittedly, that's certainly a grotesque oversimplification, especially because David Lewis, for all he's famed as a philosopher, he really didn't know his metaphysics. He actually quite infamously concedes that God might exist in other worlds, but he doesn't exist in this one. Which is, strictly speaking, completely illogical, because if the Supreme Being exists, he necessarily exists everywhere. So, not simply in some possible worlds. But that aside, other worlds are a great example, because once you actually start looking at the folklore, you'll find it matches pretty easily into some certain patterns of thought. Is that maybe a good way of putting it? Ways of, like, well, maybe I should back up for a moment here. Back up. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, famous philosopher of language, commented in his private notebooks, which were published, because why not publish his private notebooks? Goes the old argument. Culture and Value. He comments that to say after we die, we will become eternal, is strictly speaking a non sequitur because it's bad grammar. Right. What does he mean? Like, what do we think Wittgenstein? Yeah, that's... See, I know people are like, oh no, he's getting into philosophy. Duck out. What does this mean? So, Wittgenstein's point here is that if something is eternal, it is not simply endless going on into the future. It is necessarily, maybe not entirely outside time, but in some sense prior to, such that it may exist within time, which we'll get up to again later, but it is not of time. Which is a fancy way of saying it's nonsensical to say that we will become eternal, because if we are eternal, we are already eternal, have always been eternal, are currently eternal, and will not stop being eternal, because that's just the logic of what it means to be eternal. Now, to say we're endless would be quite another matter, of course. That would be quite another matter, but we're talking here about eternal. And why bring up eternity when we're talking about an other world? So I guess so. What is another world? To phrase it another way, Ryan, would you want to?
Sure.
Yeah,
So the
maybe in a
other,
Celtic context. Hmm?
mhm. So in a Celtic context, um, the other world is typically known as sort of the land of the fairies or the land of the Sidhe, which are the titular inhabitants of the other world. Um, Typically, this other world is accessed through mounds or bodies of water, like rivers or the ocean, wells, sacred springs. Um, the other world is typically known as, or it's often portrayed in Gaelic myth as this land of almost eternal youth. It's a land of abundance. Everything that grows there is sort of almost idyllic and perfect and sort of um, it's dazzlingly beautiful. There's a lot of references to like precious gems. Um, like there are castles or like castles made of gold and silver. Um, there's music, right? It's filled with the sweet noise of music, which the members of, or which the fairies, play always. Um, it's it. What else? What else is there? Oh, it's a place where death doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
It's a place of it is sort of a almost heavenly place, and it 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 sort of exists in parallel to the human world, Earth, but it also exists around it, um, and it's considered like the source of wisdom, skill, uh, healing, power, magic. Has every desirable element imaginable, and again, very dreamlike, almost very dreamlike. And that's usually how it's depicted.
Yeah. So lots going on there. Lots going on there. Um, so hold on. Let me think for a moment. Mm, So, well, before we get into the different well, yeah. So, some features there. It's a dream world or dream-like world, we should say, to avoid the perception that exists only in dreams. Dream-like world, land of fabulous, fabulous plenitude. Maybe is a nice way of putting it.
Hmm.
Um, for reasons that it's sometimes Who was that awful Icelandic folklorist who thought that people made up fairy lore because life sucked?
Oh God, take your pick. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, it was. It was some
Well,
lengthy Iceland. Hmm?
people make the same argument for heaven. It's a very
Yeah.
common, atheist argument.
Well, it goes across boundaries, eh?
Yeah.
Religious people say the same thing about both fairyland and magic. Cool. And it's like, okay. So we'll use plenitude here because once you actually start to down into like what's going on in fairyland, what's fairyland like, what are other worlds like, the idea that it is a land that is free from hardship collapses, not because it's a world filled with hardship, but because the hardship there is of a very different tenor than the hardship in our world. Some of the aspects of fairy lore that have remained true in, say, fiction. I mean, obviously, the fantabulously beautiful is certainly top of the list. The very strange. We'll be getting into a few other elements that I don't want to get into too much now, like the passage of time. But one of them is the fact that it's a land of adventure. which is not necessarily. I mean, a few reasons. Well, there's several more pragmatic reasons for why that's the case, but one of the core ones is simply that it's a different way of thinking about work. Like, people in fairyland still work. They merely engage in labor in a completely different fashion from the way in which we do in our world. And I think that is maybe the more salient remark here.
Mm-hmm.
Which holds true for heaven, too. I'm not going to get too much into heaven in this stream, because I think it would be a little dangerous to just make it look sort of identical to Fairyland. Fairyland. But the idea that we'll just sit around all day vibing in heaven, which is what you often see people use to argue that heaven will be like super boring and we should all prefer going to hell, is absolutely a load of bunk, driven by ignorance of the sources and a lack of philosophical acumen, basically. With that in mind, so it's sort of constitutive features. I have noticed, you talked about freedom from, or transmogrification of hardship, plenitude, fantabulously beautiful, but dreamlike. That all reminds me of the realms of the dead. So, would it be rational to say that the all other worlds are the underworld?
What?
Oh,
I don't think so.
No, I was opening an avenue.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I was like, I'm going to give the mic to him coolly, and he's like, "Wait, don't post cringe, bro." Yeah, common academic canard that the other world and the underworld are one and the same thing.
Yeah.
You see this. The most infamous example I know of is in Carlo Ginzburg's otherwise wonderful monograph, "Ecstasies Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath," where he interprets all otherworld journeys as underworld journeys, and concludes that therefore Cinderella is a story about death. Which I bring that up because that's obviously one of the more absurd applications of that particular thesis. Not because there's no other world motifs in Cinderella, there are quite a few actually, but because there's no indication whatsoever that it's concerned with the realms of the dead.
There is an element about the Cinderella story that I kind of figured out that I kind of want to bring up with you, which I thought was really interesting. But I mean,
Was it the
maybe.
piece?
Well, it's the glass slipper.
What about it?
Well, in dwarf. So when I was talking with you earlier, this was off stream.
Yes.
We discussed how I kind of my jadedness and my lack of patience for notions that fairies are like de-evolved gods, or I don't know, humorized gods, and how I think that's a load of nonsense if you actually bother comparing fairies, dwarf people, across the European continent and beyond, actually.
Yeah.
But one of the things that stuck out for me was the very common association between dwarves and their ability to make shoes. So it's not just the leprechaun that's the kind of shoe cobbler. You actually see German, Danish, Swiss, and other dwarves, and even actually native little people who make moccasins. They actually are very heavily tied to the shoemaker motif, which might have a lot to do with monosandalism, because they also can have like weird feet, like backwards feet or animal feet. And that got me thinking. Oh, like there are variants of the Cinderella story where the fairy godmother is like kind of like a hag. There are Scottish versions of it, and it's sort of like this hag or fairy woman. and it kind of I'm like I'm thinking about this. It's like, huh, I wonder if Cinderella might have something to do with this, because it's something I noticed. Because fair, like the little people, what we call the little people, um, uh, which I think are kind of different from the members of the Mounds, the She, although they're closely connected. Um, the little people, they when in memories that involve them moving or moving about, they are kind of said to glide over the grass or the ground or turf, right?
Mm.
They almost glide very quickly, and I think that might actually have to do with the properties of the clothing that they wear, um, because their boots, like they wear very like little or ornamented shoes, glass shoes, very beautiful. Um, and that's like there's a lot of elements of that going on.
Yeah,
So
so
I
we'll be getting into how to get into an other world in folklore in a little bit.
yeah,
But for those who are sitting a little lost right now, Cinderella is a very, very classic otherworld story.
yes,
A lot of the story, especially the bits that look a little weird to us, are deeply woven up with some really, really ancient religious motifs. You and Ryan talk about monosandalism. This is the notion that injuries to your ambulatory faculties, so whether we're talking about club foots or a wound to your leg or just losing your shoe, are one of the signs that you're no longer walking in the world of mortals, but are now in an other world, in the other world. What different types of other worlds, of course. We'll get into that in a moment. Um, Amongst other, you have the fairy godmother, which is sometimes an animal that is remade from bones, which is pretty closely tied to a lot of Siberian shamanic motifs, some European ones too. Was it the Merseburg charms? Is
yeah,
the
the
name of that?
Mercer,
Yeah,
yeah,
Merseburg charms. Yeah. Uh, I cannot remember who it was who pointed out that in most versions or many versions, Cinderella has to count peas in the ashes rather than go to the ball, which is in fact an otherworld, an attempt to confine beings to the other world and prevent them from coming to this world. Very traditional anti-vampire weapon, in case anyone here has to ever fight a vampire. Now you know. I have given you the secrets. Amongst other, we'll be avoiding. Actually, if anyone wants to really deep dive into Cinderella, there is an entire chapter analyzing it in. If you read the video description, you'll see I'm advertising my new book. I just published it 2 days ago. The Eldritch Horror Who Saved Christmas. Clearly, you can see I'm preparing for next week. And yeah, I analyze Cinderella completely there. So if you'd like to take a deep dive, you can check that out. This has been your obligatory give me money. No, it's a good story. Trust me, bros. No, but yes, um, there are several different kinds of other worlds. Basically, we mentioned like the problem with Ginsberg's attempt to sort of universalize the underworld is that in too many instances it is very obvious that the person in question is not going to the land of the dead. Right, they're going to another type of otherworld, whether it's fairyland, which doesn't normally feature the dead in spite of academic arguments to the contrary, or they're going to other worlds located in the mountains on top of clouds. There was it Jacques Vallée called it Passage to Magonia
yes.
after the famous there's a famous French kingdom that was but certainly a fairy otherworld that inspired one of probably I would say it's safe to say that's the most famous book on UFOs.
It might be, well, at least
Yeah.
on ancient UFO. Yeah,
Yeah, except maybe Whitney Strieber's Communion is maybe the only one I hear talked about more. Um, But yeah, sorry, back on target, back on target. Yeah, you've in the clouds. You do have worlds that are underground, but are not lands of the dead. Like they're underworlds in the most literal sense of that phrase. They
Yeah,
are underground.
yeah. Well, there's like the land of the dwarves, actually. Like kind of like um, there are a few, maybe not in Celtic. Well, there are some, but you also see you see that in German folklore a lot. The realm of the dwarves is said to be kind of encrusted with gems, has beautiful fields, etc. And if you feel like it's like this extended mine shaft, but it's much more brilliant and dazzling.
Yes, yeah, you do see that a lot in German CF. I think the source here is Lekuto's Encyclopedia of Germanic and Norse Folklore, Magic, and Mythology.
Um,
He
yeah,
talks about underground kingdoms in a couple of his books. I know in the Hidden History of Elves and Dwarves, which we have some complaints about, so this is a qualified endorsement. Um, in the Hidden History of Elves and Dwarves, he talks about leprechauns living under the earth and under the water in Celtic lore. An argument I've seen replicated. I want to say in Briggs. I might be. It might be Young. It might be Young. Apologies to Young if it's Briggs, or to Briggs if it's. So apologies to Young if it's him and not Briggs. But oh man, yeah. Underground. What were their names again? The Green Children, the very famous 13th
oh, the
century.
yeah of Woolpit, yes.
Yes, the Green
Um,
Children of Woolpit. Yes.
they were said to have come from a land called Saint Martin's Land, which always rained, and all they ate were green beans.
Truly an enviable diet.
Which some
Um,
people attempt to interpret as referring to, I think, like Flemish refugees.
yes, that
And it's
is
like, okay.
the major skeptical theory is you're a bigot against refugees. Yeah, if you think that this is rather obviously a story about fairies and has nothing to do with refugees, because then they would have just spoken about refugees. Because it's not like people were that stupid. But it's okay, skeptics. You can exist in that. Everyone's that dumb bubble. Yeah, Children of Woolpit lived in St. Martin's Land. Thank you. Underground, as I said, in lakes, in the clouds. Basically, I want to say everywhere. Uh, it's going to depend on the culture, but I know like even was it the Filipino elves lived in trees, but the other worlds were in trees too.
Yes. And
Yes,
native little people too.
yeah, yeah. Under the
Yeah.
hills, you see that in the Inuit. Um,
And
ice flows.
Mayoriko, the Patupayare lived in the mountains, in the mountaintops, and in the hills too, in the hill country.
Yeah. There does tend to be very specific designations for different types of fairies or different cultures. So maybe, like as I said, when I say everything, take that in a more qualified sense. But yeah, there's different types of other worlds. They all have shared features. The technical term for this in folkloristics is oikotypal variations, which is when a folk tale or folk belief or folk whatever replicates across cultures, but undergoes subtle variations to fit in with the surrounding culture. Um, Often these variations are not as extensive as modern scholars want you to think. For instance, much of the Middle Ages, like Christian clerics talking about fairies, was them puzzling over why if fairies were just demons, they didn't actually behave in any of the demonic ways. There are some real howlers in Martin Luther, like oh boy, he was hilarious because he He's giving you identical stories and beliefs that you might get from cultures that have never been Christianized. And then he's the funkiest conclusions. Like, so clearly we see that the devil has no power to hurt human beings, about a fairy that would try to get somebody to stop dumping garbage beside the stove because it's unsanitary. But it's not a major issue, so it just beat him instead of killing him. And Luther is like, clearly the devil cannot kill man. It's like, well, yes, but I think you missed the more salient issue, which is that you were eating food that was being cooked literally inches from a pile of garbage. And that was why the fairy was pissed off in the story, right? Or the house specifically.
That's a great idea for like a short story or a novel. Health Inspector Fairy.
Inspector Fairy. Yeah, it was. It's so, as some of you may know that certain fairies were assigned to the domicile, right? House spirits. Brownies being the most famous example in the West. Many don't know this. This is also what the original meaning of the word hobgoblin. They were originally house spirits. Hob being part of the house, right? The goblin of the hob. They would live behind. Typically, they would live behind the stove in Europe. Although I actually think this belief replicates pretty extensively outside of Europe, wherever stoves can be found. Because I know I saw it in China with the stovetop god. But sorry, back to Europe. You have the brownie, you have the hobgoblin, you have the domovoi in Russia. Lives behind the stove. Requests occasional offerings of milk, and in return it helps keep your house clean. If you are being weird and slovenly and gross and doing stuff that annoys it, it'll get mad at you. And do stuff like throw your dishware around, or tie your hair to the bed, or beat you with a spoon. And in the story we're currently talking about, the kitchen boy kept dumping all the dirty water right beside the stove, which is a huge health risk, as anyone who's ever cooked in a kitchen is well aware. And the very irate fairy kept telling him to stop, and he kept saying, "I ain't stopping, bro," until one day the fairy tied him to the ceiling. Say, "Stop doing this." And Luther draws, I don't say precisely the wrong conclusion, but his conclusion is completely peripheral to what was going on. And yet he has the exact same set of facts.
Yeah.
So we talk about...
No, I said I was agreeing with it. Well, speaking of, today is also Reformation Day.
Oh, so we can crap on Martin Luther some more.
Yes.
Like, his vampire attacks aren't real. People just die because they believe in vampires. They just drop dead. That was another classic. That was another classic Lutheranism. Yeah, Martin, let's just say you can really see why Lutherans do not die on the hill that Martin Luther was a perfect person. In fact, interestingly and thankfully, Luther's demonology proved to be one of the least influential aspects of his entire philosophy, in terms of the degree to which almost no later Lutheran has echoed it, because it's obvious rot. But yeah, academics will sometimes provide really weird readings. There was a book published recently that argued that spirit marriages in Europe were emblematic of Christians' repressed desire to commit adultery, which is wild because spirit marriages are universal and have nothing to do with Christianity or any repressed desires whatsoever. But yeah, back on target. So we talk about archetypal variations. You do get that with a lot of these folk beliefs about, where the fairies are living, and sometimes it does reflect the contents of the Otherworld, right? Like, obviously, Otherworld stories set in kingdoms in the clouds or at the top of mountains feature a much less heavy emphasis on um, massive amounts of gems and wealth being built everywhere. But even then, it's still pretty consistent. And so you'd often, one of the things that was intriguing to me was how many otherworld stories are filled with rote observations of people's agriculture. It's like, how do they grow their food deep underground? It's like, well, and then they several pages explaining how Hulderfolk survive under the mounds of Denmark without using underground crops. Which also shows there's a similar story in some of the, I think it's Seder Olam Rabbah and the Zohar in the Jewish tradition talk about the B'nai Hayim, the children of Cain, who live in a kingdom under the earth, and they mention that they can't grow wheat down there, which affects their memory. Which is, I guess, an interesting bit of interesting archetypal variations. We shift across cultures. But yeah, in general, the constitutive features of Otherworlds are they're fantastically beautiful. They are filled with plenitude, while not necessarily being exempt from hardship or strange monsters. Quite the contrary. 90% of the time, people are going to the Otherworld. It's to get into a fist fight with someone. And they are very dreamlike. Right. It's that last one we're going to focus on next. So you want to talk about, Ryan, you know a little more than I do about, so you get spirited away, right? You get kamikakushi, I think is the chapter. You get spirited away, you get kidnapped. A week passes for you in the Otherworld, during which you sup with the fairies, receive instructions in magic, so on and so forth. And then you come back and you're like, gee, where is everyone? And somebody's like, oh, this is the guy who vanished 700 years ago.
Yeah.
Ryan, would you care to talk about that?
And then upon hearing those words, in most cases, they suddenly turn to like ash or dust, and they fade away.
Yes,
because all their years are, they catch up to them.
Except in China, where they go back to fairyland.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Sometimes in other instances, they might, if it's not like over hundreds of years, they might just revert back to the age they were. Or no, actually, no, sorry, I got that wrong. If years pass and they remain youthful in the other world, when they return, they'll suddenly grow to the age they're supposed to be. So you might stay there, like Wild Philosopher said, you might stay there a week, or feels like a week. Then you return to the mortal realm, and it turns out you are gone for like 20 years, and then suddenly you advance in age, at least 20 years in the future. So that's they're actually like memorites. So people who've claimed to actually seen this happen.
Yes. As opposed to what's the tale? The tale of the fisherman and the mermaid or whatever in Japan.
Yeah,
which is going to be a well-known legend or saga, Margin, sorry, in the same.
Yeah.
Right, where she says, you can go back to the earth, just don't open this box. And he opens the box, and his 80 years catches up with him, and he dies.
Yeah. So that one, a lot of the ones I've read have a Marchin quality to them. But there are actually a few memorites that do have, or that do involve that. So the Marchins are very, very downstream from the experiences.
Yes. Which,
again, I'll continue.
Oh, so I was going to say, again, for those listening into our streams for the first time, or for the first time in a little bit, the Marchin Sagan distinction in folkloristics is it's just a technical term for the difference between fictional stories and putative descriptions of real events, right? Cinderella's a Marchen, right? Beauty and the Beast is a Marchen. These are folk tales. They are not supposed to be real in the way, like, it's like, think of the difference between stories about Sherlock Holmes and Ebenezer Scrooge as like Marchen legends versus stories about Napoleon and Caesar, right? They might be false. The latter might, like, it might not be true that Napoleon was ridiculously short, for instance, but the stories are supposed to be true. And thus they are what we would call Sagen or Memorits, or just supernatural encounters, basically. So just to quickly recap the little distinction there. It's basically the academic distinction between stories about Sherlock Holmes and stories about, like, Napoleon as applied to fairies. And funnily enough, in spite of the fact that we use fairy tale to mean like a fake story, most fairy tales don't feature fairies, and most tales involving fairies are actually memorits. So most of them are meant to be, which isn't to say they are real, it's just to say they are meant to be real and have to be interpreted with that in mind.
Yeah. Most, which is funny, most encounters with fairies are historical, or claim to be anyway.
Yeah. Whereas fairies just often don't even appear in quote unquote fairy tales. Like, if you sit down and read, if you get your hands on the first edition of the Brothers Grimm's tales, for instance, and sit down and read it, you will notice that almost all of them do not involve fairies. Right? There's definitely some very important. I mean, there's the 12 Dancing Princesses, for entry, which is a fairly clear otherworld marching, right? Legend involving an otherworld. Most of them involve like talking animals, or witches, or all sorts of other people who just aren't fairies, right? Trolls, etc.
Yeah.
And the same holds true. I won't say, yeah, like, I've read about half of the fairy books Andrew Lang published, and most of them just don't have any fairies. Really fun, like, funnily enough. But yeah, back. I guess. Sorry, so I'll let you pick up again. Sorry for interrupting. Just felt I'd remind people about the distinction there. Or did you have anything more to say about the other world and time?
Not that I know of. It's pretty straightforward, actually. Fairly simple Wicca type.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough,
Yeah.
fair enough. I mean, the obvious question then is going to be why.
Yeah, why?
Right, we have this belief. I won't say it's universal, but I will say it's international, which is simply to say that it replicates across a great number of unrelated cultures globally. And the answer is going to be why. Now, put aside the all this stuff is real and actually happened argument, which certainly would explain all this. But we're good secular scholars, and I'm going to give you a little secular analysis, basically. And my little secular analysis here, if I may, is, you remember I mentioned at the start of the stream, I quoted Wittgenstein to the effect that eternity is outside time, and therefore it might take place within time, but it is always prior to time, which means it's irrational to say, for instance, he will be eternal, because if he will be eternal, he necessarily was eternal and currently is eternal. Eternality is simply a component of his existence. Right? It's true at all times by virtue of being true trans-temporally. And why do I bring this up? Because the main difference between the other world of fairyland, or the underworld, or the mountaintops, or Magonia, or Elysium, or whatever else you might like to pick, and the other world of reincarnated in another world in my smartphone, is that other worlds are not the physical world. right? They do not take place within the bounds of space-time as a sphere, which is going to be the what was in classical metaphysics called the six dimensions. Forward, backward, side to left side, right side, up and down. Obviously, this is a very limited way of analyzing space, but this is how they talked about it in antiquity, and we're just going to roll with it rather than trying to rejig ancient folklore to fit modern physics, right? They take place. Other worlds are not in the physical world, right? This is why they have that dreamlike quality. The elements are all mixed up. The physicality aspect is different. The space is different, and the time is different, right? And in other worlds, you are very much not moving in the sort of linear world within which we move. You are moving about in the world of eternity, right? You're outside. You're partially outside time, which is why if you suddenly re-enter the time stream, you can just get screwed. And that's going to be the sort of logical underpinning to stories about other worlds. Did you want to proceed directly to the connection to Halloween, or did you want to talk a little bit more about initiation and otherworld gateways?
Well, let's go into initiation.
Yeah. We'll talk about initiation and otherworld gateways, yeah. And we'll build down to, because we're going to end, the whole point of this stream is like, why is there a Halloween belief why is there a belief that on All Hallows Eve the dead ride? And fairies. And the saints. And Satan. Skies are pretty crowded tonight. That's all I'll say. Tonight is not the night to get on your broomstick. The airspace is just a nightmare. It's just a nightmare. Trust me, bros. Do not. You're going to get on your broomstick. You'll be like broadsided by 3 ogres and cut off by like a dozen leprechauns, and then there's all the dead on their horses, and Satan off to dig more ditches for free in bets with random hillbillies. And then there's the saints who are coming down to cry about the Reformation and the fact that they're no longer getting saints' days. And so on and so forth. Lucha's probably floating around too. Because why not? But yes. One of the most consistent or consistently interesting features of, say, stories about initiation. So this is going to be, I'm a normal person. I am normal philosopher, right? Wild philosopher's less based cousin. Normal philosopher's going around, and he becomes initiated. And I don't mean this in the, say, secular sense, like he joins the Freemasons, or I'm not a Freemason. Let's be clear here. Trust me, bros.
Or the Church of Scientology.
Yeah, well, the Church of Scientology is actually loosely based on real initiations. Just if they were, science fiction. But yeah, it's not. L. Ron Hubbard really got into Neo Advaita before he went and made Scientology, and you can actually see a lot of more traditional religious notions echoing through his otherwise highly unimpressive form of scientific objectivism, basically. But so back away, and we're not talking about like when you get your technically in a sense, sort of like getting a master's degree or a PhD is an initiation, right? You're being initiated into the ranks of the intelligentsia, you might say. I mean here an actual esoteric initiation where you become, a shaman or a wizard or a practitioner of something like Waitsa or Boran Kamatana, or into a Taoist lineage, a genuine esoteric initiation here. And normal philosopher, he's wandering about, he starts to get the sweats, right? He gets sick, and he collapses in his room. A period of illness is often a prelude to initiations in a lot of native cultures, and I think in Siberia too, right?
I don't know.
Okay, I could be wrong on that one. It's been a while since I studied the specifics of Siberian age. Yeah, but he collapses in his room, and then he experiences a vision. I'm going to use the Inuits as my exemplar here, with the proviso that this replicates generally across cultures, with the exception of the giant walrus. He undergoes a vision. A giant walrus speaks to him. I want to say its name is Avar Pak. I am always terrible at remembering Inuit names.
Yeah, I know the walrus you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. The giant walrus shows up in his vision, like a vision of ice and the snow and the sun, and the light glinting harshly off the permafrost, waves crashing, and a giant walrus speaks to him, and it informs him that if he'll only allow himself to be devoured by the walrus and reborn out the other end, then he will become an angakok. He'll be initiated into shamanism. If the shaman chooses to follow through, if he undergoes that consumption, that dismemberment, that reconstruction, and comes back out whole the other side, now he exists in two realms. Right? He exists in our realm, the physical world, or at least what we take to be our realm, because of course, in some sense, at least as traditional metaphysicians would have it, all of us exist in the other world. He exists in our realm. He has 1 foot in our world, and he has 1 foot in the other world. Right? He's both fully human and fully divine, you might say, to pick an example. Because again, you see this sort of in. Is it Corinthians where Paul talks about we are entombed with him and reborn with him?
I think so.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I think it's Corinthians. But at any rate, that's the quote, right? Paul talks about how we die with Jesus on the cross, are pierced, and then are reborn with him in our new spiritual bodies, which is sort of theosis. And from then on, we are not fully human, fully divine in the same way Jesus is, which is I cannot remember the name for that belief, but that particular belief was condemned in 560 for being heresy. So I'm not going to assert that on my stream because somebody will get mad. But in a certain sense, we are fully human and fully divine through our co-participation in the death of Jesus upon the cross. Right? We have entered into that other world. You see this in the myth of Isis and Osiris in the Greco-Roman mystery cult of Isis and Osiris. You see this in Mithras. You see this in the Merseburg charms. Right, I am chopped up and made whole again. Right. And you remember earlier when I was talking about Cinderella, I mentioned in quite a few of the versions, it's not her fairy or the fairy godmother is a feature of the Charles Perrault story, which is much more Cinderella's about 6,000 years old minimum. It's certainly Proto-Indo-European. It might be older, depending on how trustworthy you think some Chinese or native variants are. Scholars don't think they're reliable. If they are, Cinderella could be like 30,000 years old.
Yeah.
But that aside, back 6,000 years if we're being conservative. And the fairy is traditional, but it is more version we're familiar with is more recent, the Charles Perrault version. And a lot of other versions, it's not a fairy per se. It still is a sort of fairy-like being, but it's actually before her death, her mother gave her an animal. And the animal is either killed by the stepmother or eaten by the stepmother. It's like her pet cow, her pet pig, her pet chicken, something to that effect, her pet. And she, in despair, buries the bones under her favorite tree, often the tree her mother planted for her. which is also symbolically important, but I won't get too much into that right now. Although if you're familiar with the tree of Odin, you can see where the obvious meaning might be. And you buries the bones under the tree, and then when she's crying, the bones emerge and reconstitute themselves into a living spiritual animal. This particular motif echoes heavily in the initiation stories of a great number of Siberian shamans, for instance. And in, I think my citation here being Vitebsky, is it the reindeer people? The land of the reindeer men? Vitebsky reindeer something something. And also in native folklore. Right? It's this sort of, you undergo this death and rebirth in the other world. And through this action, you become partially human, partially something else, as we say. So, I'm trying to open it up, and Amazon's like, do you want to download the app? And it's like, no, I don't want to download the app. Bugger off. Sorry. Oh yeah, I got it right. Piers Vitebsky, the reindeer people, which is a more recent anthropological analysis of modern-day Siberian shamanism, but it reflects a lot of much older concepts. So that being said, I noted my example was from the Inuit, and I talked about illness. And illness there acts as the sort of the gateway, right? You become sick. This sickness acts as a, what you call it, sort of psychological divorce from your regular state of mind. And it opens you up to the other world, which is always present, but unnoticeable, shall we say. At least with the normal eyes we go about with. But there are other ways to reach that other world. One of them, especially one that's relevant in a Celtic context, is going to be gates. I know you were the one who wanted to bring this up. Did you have anything you wanted to say here before I launch into my stuff?
Yeah, so to put it simply, there are ways of entering the other world. And when we're discussing entry into the other world, some people might be turned off or might look at, or I don't know, look askance at the implication that you can go there, bodily. That typically seems to be the implication. Like, it's not simply that it's a dreamlike world because you visit it in your dreams, although you kind of can do that. It's, in most of the myths, the legends, and even the memorites, it is somewhere you can have, like, I guess you'd say, physical access to, which is to say you can just walk there. You can literally walk in. And that's why, that's why you have the theme of being spirited away, because you go missing. Right? People go missing. Like, it's a physical. You get physically displaced.
And then and in a lot of Japanese memorites, they then find you in like the rafters of the building 5 days later.
Yeah.
Or in the middle of the mountains or some other place you can't rationally have reached, especially if you're a child. Yeah, it is one of a lot of spiritual beliefs sort of challenge our conventional ideas about how the world works.
Oh, yeah.
Because as I said, the other world is not primarily a physical place, and yet you can go there physically and come back, and then go there again. In the case of Sir Launfal, which is a famous French romance, probably based on an earlier law now about a knight who marries the fairy queen and goes back to the human world. And then he nearly gets murdered by Queen Guinevere because the jealous queen wants him to tell her that she's the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, and being an honorable knight, he can't lie, and the most beautiful woman is his wife, the fairy queen. So he refuses to do anything and he's basically on death's door because they're going to kill him for disrespecting the queen, right? When finally he calls for the fairy queen to show up, and she does, with all of her handmaidens, and all the knights are in attendance. Are like, "Yep, sorry, Guinevere, fairy queen's hotter." Uh, that's
A man of
basically the
taste.
line.
A man of taste.
And then the fairy queen. There's a couple different versions. In some of the later versions, the fairy queen irately leaves, and Sir Launfal has to hunt her down. But in the original version, the fairy queen gives Sir Launfal a horse, and they go back to fairy realm, never to be seen again, except on certain holy nights, certain nights like Halloween, actually, when they can be heard gallivanting through the countryside with their full, what would you call the retinue? Their retinue behind them. As I said, the nights are really crowded skies tonight. You're competing with 800-year-old Arthurian knights and the saints and the fairy queen. They're all out and about tonight. There is a reason for that, which we will get to momentarily. But yeah, as I said, physical gateways. Some of them even we know precisely where they were supposed to be. Right? You know the old, what is it? The portal to hell trope. You sometimes still see that in fiction, eh?
Oh yeah.
There were a few places in ancient Greece. There was a famous island in Ireland that was believed to be an opening to purgatory, and they thought that you could go there to get to experience purgatory in advance, so you know what it would be like.
That's funny.
Yeah, they would go on vacation, and they would experience purgatory. It's like, oh yeah, put me through that purgative suffering. This is the origin. If I remember correctly, this is actually the first reference to purgatory in a Catholic text, which is why some Protestants think it's like based on a pagan superstition. I could be wildly off about that because I will fully concede to not having studied some of the more obscure elements of the Catholic Protestant dispute in depth, but that was what my source here said. Which I want to say was Le Couteau. But yeah, usually physical locations, often, sometimes not marked, or like, because he has individual trees, clouds, mountaintops, or marked but hotly contested. There was a long-standing belief for several hundred years that there was a floating island in Loch Lomond, a sort of fairy realm that could only be seen at certain times. And obviously it was rather hard to get there from the Earth. But if you could, of course, that would have been an Otherworld access point. Obviously, that belief came in for a fair amount of ridicule in the early modern period, and people don't like to talk about it nowadays. But it was cited pretty extensively for about 300 years. Quite well known, because some of our sources for this are from the Netherlands. It's like, oh yeah, if you go to Scotland, they have an opening to Fairyland in Loch Lomond. It's a flying island. Brings a different meaning to, and you'll take the high road, and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. Which is admittedly about death, so maybe not quite too much a different reading. But yeah, anything, I think, like, as the gateway is pretty straightforward. It's what people do with them that's more interesting, unless you had something else you wanted to add on there.
Yeah. They can also be like stones too. And then there's, the mounds. Actually, there is in one legend, the legend of John Dietrich, one way to actually gain access to the fairy realm, or at least another world, is by putting on a fairy hat, so one of their little cocked caps, their little fairy caps, and then the mound will rise to show the gateway to the realm of the fairies. and that one was pretty fun to read.
Who was that again?
So Thomas Kitely in his book recorded on the Isle of Rugen, the legend of John Dietrich.
I might have to re-review some of the Mithraic lore around hats then.
Yeah.
Because they actually have some similar beliefs, but I hadn't been connecting them to the other world because it's all iconographic. Sorry, that's wildly aside, completely speculative, but yeah, the little Smurf hat that you will see gnomes wearing, it's the freedom cap of the Mithraists, right?
Yeah.
And it signified that they'd been initiated into the cult of Mithras, god of loyalty, oaths, honor, everything you don't get in the modern corporate world, friendship, harmony, and so on. And the most famous myth of Mithras, of course, is him slaying the bull. The one that a lot of people don't know about, but was the actual sort of center point of Mithraic mythology, was was the sun god. Mithras probably killed the bull of Helios, right? Because the two stories that we know of involving Mithras are he kills a bull, and Helios comes down out of the heavens looking really angry in one panel, and then in the next panel, him and Mithras are shaking hands. He offers Mithras his crown. Mithras rejects it. Mithras offers him, Helios, the Mithraic hat. And as this is the hat, it's the hat that showing that you're no longer constrained by fate, which includes both the astrological planets in an ancient context, and in our context would include like vague inclinations, weird moods, habit, all the stuff that seizes you and forces you to do stupid stuff, basically. Like, not subscribe to this channel. I'm kidding. Anywho, he gives the Mithraic cap to Helios, which is so there's a lot going on there, a lot of eschatology, a lot of soteriology, some ethics, reflections on the proper nature of a king. But at core, this is a sort of connection between initiation and freedom, which is very traditional in some of the older Roman beliefs. Same with they have a similar stuff involving Marsyas. Wild speculation hours. Yeah, the standing stones element is true. A lot of monuments like Stonehenge were believed to be places that were especially beloved by the fairies. And there's a lot of random boulders littering the English, Irish, Scottish countryside that are believed to either be entryways to the fairy world or places that that dance about at night. Where the fairies dance about at night, or the boulders, dance about at night. I want to say Jeremy Hart has a database on that, where he rebuts several well-known skeptical arguments and endeavors to prove that boulders do in fact dance. Some of the finest scholarship I've ever seen. That's not a joke. Dancing boulders are real, bro. Absolute monumental effort there on his part. But somebody quit and growth. Like, how can he talk about dancing boulders? Back on target. It is in, and then there's the mushroom circles, actually. And I was really surprised to be. I was taking a course on mycology, not for any to help with gardening, because I have a passive interest in called my bioremediation. And the book I was reading actually went into very secular book, and it mentioned that the mushrooms involved in fairy rings are actually technically immortal. Short of literally destroying that piece of dirt entirely, like atomizing it, you cannot kill them. They will survive anything. So kind of funny on that one, actually. But yeah, gateways to the other world. Anything else you want to say, or can we go into time?
You can go into time.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, as I said, so all of the examples we've been given so far have dealt with space, right? Physical objects, biological objects, people, right? You can, in fact, yeah, people. With that being said, it is a sort of, I would say, universal, international belief that certain moments are particularly propitious, as we should call it, for gaining entry to the other world. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Halloween being the best example. Or one of them, actually. Probably the best to an English speaker nowadays. St. John's Eve was historically the nidus of magic, more so than any others, which is why Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night's Dream is all about fairies coming into our world on St. John's Eve, Midsummer's Night. With that being said, basically any saint day was believed to be exceptionally propitious for crossings to the other world. Right. A lot of stuff about Christmas. Another Shakespeare example here, Twelfth Night, right? Is you have this sort of cosmic inversion would be a good name for it, eh?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The theme. So one of the major themes of festivals historically, which is tragically missing from our festivals, and which we struggle to bring back because of modern day cringe, is the sort of theme of cosmic inversion. Right.
Right.
It's this primordial notion, that there's something wrong with the world. Can't imagine what. But yeah, there's something wrong, very, very wrong with the world. And yet at certain highly propitious moments on holy days, holidays, festivals, when the other world comes into contact with our own, it flips our world upside down. But not to lead everything into chaos and disaster and nightmares, but so that we can see the world's right side up again. Right? There's something horribly awry or tilted about our world, and it's only going to be straight through it, that sort of action of tilting. This is very, very, very traditional, mostly everywhere. Like you see this in the Bible. But certainly in European holidays, St. John's Eve, Halloween, like why it's the night of the saints, All Hallows Eve, just as saints in general. And what are we doing? We're getting dressed up as goblins. Hi, you can look at me. I'm here. Yeah, you're getting dressed up as goblins, getting dressed up as ghosts, ghouls, ghastlies, to go gallivanting about the countryside asking for goodies. Christmas Eve is another good example, right? You have the practice of getting up in. It used to be highly traditional, and in some places still is, to put on, like 12th Night, for instance, is when all the men dress up as women and all the women dress up as men, right? In Shakespeare's play. That's not Shakespeare being weird. That's an actual holiday custom of the time that actually goes back to Rome. There's complaints about the Romans trying to get the Christians to do this in some of the early Christian martyrologies. Right, they would get dressed up as a woman or an animal or something like, and then they'd go door to door caroling and begging for money in Rome. And of course, I want to say we do that nowadays. We did that throughout much of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and it has tragically mostly died off, at least where I live. I don't think I've ever seen a caroler. I don't know about you.
No.
Yeah, heartbreaking. I'm not Christian, but I'm reviving it this year. So, general holidays enthusiast, I will be showing up at your doors in my Santa suit, singing songs. Probably go Hanukkah, asking for money. No. Snacks. Maybe not going to Hanukkah for money, but Sorry, don't report me, guys. But sorry, there is this ongoing theme involving. Hound Pursues says, I've been caroling. So at least one of us has been caroling. The noble tradition continues. But yes, it's this sort of theme of this cosmic inversion, right, where the world goes tilted so that you can see things properly standing up. And that tends to be the element in which it most directly intersects with the other world, right, where there's an eruption across worlds, our world enters the other world enters ours, and this affects a transformation in our person, right? And it's chaotic to some extent, it's ordered to a greater extent, even if it looks like it's chaos peripherally. General sign is that of merriment. Right? Why is Halloween a holiday? And like, why aren't we all quaking in our boots at the thought of the ghosts? Right? Like, why wasn't this the hideaway day? Now you know. Same for Christmas, right? God rest ye merry gentlemen. We'll keep my carols till 2 hours, 3 hours from now when Halloween's over, and I can start being really annoying and torment everyone with my unwanted November Christmas carols. God rest ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. Was born on Christmas Day. But yes, we have this cosmic inversion, and that sometimes has nothing to do with time, but there isn't a special relationship between cosmic inversions and the festivals in which the other world is intensely wrapped up. This isn't just European. I mentioned the Bible. There's a few of the Mao Shan texts from Taoism, which are 2nd to 6th century, I want to say. Primarily in the 4th, though. That was when they were at their apex in terms of literary creativity. Talk about the Chinese festivals in the same way. There's a famous text called The Method of Holding the Three Ones, translated by Poul Anderson, with 2 E's, not the sci-fi novelist, the completely unknown sinologist, talking about the exact same thing in a Chinese context. And the guy who wrote that book, the original book, of course, The Method of Holding the Three Ones, had absolutely no knowledge of any... Did I cut out there? My screen cut.
Nope, you're good. You're good.
Okay. The guy who wrote that, the Mao Shan priest who wrote that had absolutely no knowledge of any Roman customs. I can guarantee that. So that's just fascinating. With that in mind, I think we have given enough background to explain why, yes, in fact, Halloween is the night the dead go riding. Right. Did you have anything else you want to talk about Sacred Time before I proceed there?
Nope, you're good.
Alrighty. So one of the quintessential aspects of a holiday, as anyone who's read about the subject or anyone who's ever kept one sincerely knows, is it is an eruption of the eternal into temporality. Like the holidays differ. How does this day differ from all other days? The 4 questions of Passover asks, and the answer. I mean, not the answer ritually, but the answer to that question is the holidays differ from regular days in that they may superficially take place in the physical world through physical time, like Christmas. Our Halloween starts at a given hour. It starts, 4 p.m. on today's Thursday the 31st, and it ends at like 3 or 4 in the morning when people stop partying. That's the time of Halloween. And yet, in another and more profound sense, Halloween is eternal, right? It takes place outside of time. And when you keep Halloween, you may still be existing in our world, but you have that foot in the other world. Right. And so why are holidays so intensely associated with the other world? Because that is precisely what a holiday is. Right. It is a day, or several days if we're talking about like Passover or Ramadan. Actually, I shouldn't say Ramadan. I don't know about the symbolism there. But yeah, Passover, 12 nights of Christmas, where you have 1 foot in the earth and 1 foot in the other world. Like you're here and you're in fairyland simultaneously. And so you want to talk about like why do the dead ride? It's not because the dead are going riding tonight when they never go riding ever per se. It's because it's tonight, and unlike October 30th or November 1st is technically also a holiday, but November 2nd, November 3rd, tonight of all other nights is a night that exists in the eternal or in the other world. And it's a night where, therefore, man can see that which he normally does not have the ability to see. So yeah, that was, you want to know, like, why festivals in the other world? Why is tonight the night you should, don't go flying because the skies will be a little crowded, but why tonight should you go out hunting for fairies and gnomes till 3 in the morning? Now you know. You know. Anything to add on, Ryan?
Nope. I think you summed it up nicely.
Alrighty. We can probably end here, eh?
Yep.
Yeah, beautiful. So no stream Sunday because I will be woodling around away from my computer. Tragically, heartrendingly. We will see about streams next week. It might be a bit of a weird week.
Yeah.
But no stream this Sunday and no stream next Sunday. There might be a stream during the week though, so maybe keep an eye on the channel for that reason. But it has been an absolutely pleasure having you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very, very much. If you enjoyed this stream, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, send it to your friends, kiss it, offer it up on your altar to Luce, so on and so forth. And
The Vatican,
such like.
The Vatican's new mascot. That's what we're talking about.
Yes. She has stolen my heart. The ancient Taoist treaties say, we all exist by theft, and thus the search for, salvation is to some extent the reversion of theft, right? Because whether we're stealing the life of plants or animals or the soil or the air, Luce has stolen my heart. Yes, she's undergone that shamanic transformation through me. Indeed. But yes, have a wonderful evening. Always remember that fairies are real. And happy Halloween.